Hello everyone, today I'm going to be talking about how to effectively use TACTICS.TOOLS and how to best apply statistics to your TFT gameplay. I'm making this video because I've seen a lot of incorrect application of stats in the TFT community, and in this video, I want to highlight 5 common statistical mistakes that many players and streamers, even those who are extremely high ranked, commonly make. To give myself a short introduction, my name is Dank Memes. I'm currently 1528 LP, ranked 9 on the North American servers, and I'm also a college data science graduate. Before I get into the mistakes, I want to give a brief overview of what I think the most useful features of TACTICS.TOOLS are for people who may not be familiar with stats or how to use this website. So the 2 main features that I find myself most commonly using are both under the Stats tab, and it's going to be the Augments and the Explorer feature. So this Augment feature is most useful for giving a generic overview of the strongest augments in the game overall, and it's mainly used when you are not playing a specific composition. So you can see we can filter on 2-1 when the game plan is often very flexible. And we can see which augments are the best performing on average. However, if you are playing a specific comp or line, the most useful feature is then going to be this Explorer over here, which allows us to filter our data based on specific units, items, or augments. One thing to note is that there is an Advanced Explorer with more filters and options. However, given that most people watching this probably don't have access to that, as it is only available to patrons, I'll just be talking about the basic version for this video. So to give a brief example of how to use this Explorer, let's say we want to see what augments are the best for our, let's say Karthus Akali comp, right? So what we would do here is we would filter by Karthus and Akali, right? And, let's say we're playing the Superfan version of the comp, right? We can also filter by 3 Superfan. And just like this, if you click on the Augments tab over here, we can see, similarly to the augments, but more specific for the Karthus Akali comp specifically, we can see augments again in 2-1, 3-2, and 4-2. We can also sort by silver, gold, and prismatic. And additionally, what this Explorer is also useful for is also very useful for seeing items. So, for example, let's say I wanted to see what the best items on Karthus are, right? I could just go to this Items tab. I could search up Karthus, and what we're looking at here is the Delta column. The Delta meaning above or below average, the difference from the average, right? So plus Delta meaning slightly meaning worse than average, and minus Delta meaning better than average. So as we can see, we can from this data we can determine that items like Shojin, JG, and Rabadons are about average on Karthus, whereas items like Adaptive, Nashers, and Morello are slightly better than average on Karthus. So now that I've given a brief overview of what I believe are the most useful features of TACTICS.TOOLS, I'm going to get into the 5 most common mistakes that people make while using statistics. So the first mistake I want to talk about is introducing excessive bias in the filtering process. And what I mean by this is when your data is being excessively influenced by outside variables that may lead you to incorrect conclusions. So I'll give you an example, right? Let's say we're playing Yone Reroll, and we're trying to determine which augments are the best for our comp. How do we set up our filters to get the most accurate data? The most obvious approach here would probably be, let's just sort by Yone 3, right? Because that's, logically what we're trying to play, right? But it's actually the incorrect approach, and here's why. So let's say we're trying to pick between augments such as Hero, Grab Bag, and Harm Assist, right? By looking at this data, we would probably think that Harm Assist is much better than Hero Grab Bag, and that Hero Grab Bag is a really, really bad option on Yone. But this is actually not necessarily the case, as by only filtering by Yone 3, we've actually taken a really biased sample of the data, by excluding all of the games where we don't end up actually hitting Yone 3. The games when we're Yone 2 the whole game, and we probably just go 7th or 8th, right? All this filter is actually telling us right now is that if we do end up hitting Yone 3, Harm Assist is a much better option than Hero Grab Bag. So how do we filter this instead? Instead of only filtering by Yone 3, we can instead create a filter like this, such as Yone, Zed, and Kale, right? And under this filter, we are still pretty much guaranteed to be playing Yone Reroll, right? But we are not introducing any of the outside bias that comes with specifically filtering for Yone 3. So going back to the original example, we can see now that the 2 augments are much closer, right? We can see that Hero Grab Bag is actually a pretty solid option on Yone, but that Harm Assist might be slightly better in most spots. And so I'll give you one more example of this, right? Let's say we're trying to evaluate how strong Misfortune Reroll is, right? So if we filter by Misfortune 3, and let's also say we're playing the Superhand version, so we would have Lilia and Nico, for example, we can see that this comp averages a 3.65 if we have MF3, which is pretty reasonable, right? If we only looked at this data, we'd probably conclude that Misfortune 3 is a pretty strong comp, right, if we can hit. However, if you look slightly deeper into the data, we can actually find that almost 20% of the time, this comp is being played with that styles augment, which increases the average placement from 3.65 to 3.10, right? So the correct conclusion that we should be making from this data is not that misfortune is a really strong comp, but that it's really strong with the DATS Jazz augment. And that if we don't have this augment, we should probably avoid the comp unless our spot is really, really good for it. So in conclusion, to avoid any bias in the selection process, we need to be extremely conscious of what variables we are filtering our data by, and be aware of any outside variables that might skew our data and lead us to incorrect conclusions. Alright, so the second mistake that I wanted to talk about today is when we draw from datasets that are too small to accurately support any conclusions. To illustrate this, I have an example from Soju's stream. So as we can see here, Soju is trying to determine how strong his chosen Infinity Edge Hand of Justice Idealism Ezreal 2 is going to be. And we can see that its average is at 5.31 with 16 game sample size. Obviously, I don't think Soju was being completely serious here. She's kind of just joking around with chat. But of course, having a 16 game sample size is far too low to make any accurate conclusions. And the point here is that when we introduce too many filters in our data, too many unnecessary filters, we reduce the overall confidence that we can have in our conclusions. So in this example, if we were actually trying to determine how good Idealism Hodge is on Ezreal, we could probably just get rid of the Shodan filter and get rid of this IE filter, right? And that would probably give us enough data to make a reasonable conclusion. And to give a certain number for how many data points that we would actually need to be confident in our data, I would probably say at least several hundred games, and ideally at least 500 to maybe 1,000 games in our dataset. And another instance where sample size becomes an issue is when we are looking at lines that are infrequently played, such as lines that require specific augments. So for example, one comp that can be difficult to find data for is Twin Terror comps, right? Because they obviously require the Twin Terror augment to play. So you can see here, if we filter by Twin Terror, Twitch, and Vex, you can see that some of these augments only have a few hundred data points, and this is more than halfway throughout the patch. In the early days of the patch, there's even less data to look at. And so one thing that we can do to mitigate this is actually to look at last patch's data, right? We can see that going from this patch to last patch, we more than tripled the amount of data entries in the data set, which can give us more accurate results. Obviously, we would not do this if the last patch significantly changed the line that we are looking at, of course. So to summarize, we want to avoid filtering the data unnecessarily, and we always want to try to have at least several hundred, if not more data points to get the most accurate results. Third of all, and this is what I think is probably the most common mistake that I'm going to be talking about in this video, is either over-relying or under-relying on statistics to make decisions. When using stats, I think the single most important skill that someone can have is to know exactly how much lies to put on the data, and to really understand when you should and should not trust the stats. I think the key here is really to view statistics as just one variable in your decision-making process. So for example, if you're picking an augment, right, the stats are just one component of this. There's also your board state, your gold, your items, and many other variables that all have to factor in. So I'll give a few examples of over-reliance and under-reliance here. So in this clip, which is from one of my games, I'm choosing my 2-1 Prismatic, and I'm deciding between Level Up and Radiant Relics as my two best options. If you look at the stats on 2-1, right, we can see that Radiant Relics is one of the better Prismatics on 2-1, whereas Level Up generally doesn't perform as well. However, we can't only look at the numbers, right? We have to consider all the other variables. So in this instance, since the portal is Scuttle Puddle, and I made 20 on 1-4 but only playing one unit, even though the stats on Radiant Relics are much better, Level Up is a better choice in this spot. The reverse of this, however, and actually under-relying on stats can be just as problematic. And I think one augment that really highlights this is the augment Frequent Flyer. As you can see from the play rate, a lot of players, especially those who are maybe lower ranked, really like taking this augment, despite its relatively poor stats. I would probably guess this is because its effect, which makes your rerolls cost 1, it sounds like it would be really, really powerful. You know, you get twice the gold to roll, right? But if you look deeper in the stats, we can see that basically every single comp in the game, besides maybe Punk reroll, has a positive delta with this augment, meaning that it's performing worse than average. And so I think the takeaway here really is that augments with bad stats are bad for a reason, no matter how strong their effects might sound, generally. And this doesn't only apply to augments, right? In the same vein, you know, there's a reason why Rageblade is plus delta on almost every single carry. And likewise, for example, if, you know, Twisted Blade and Blitzcrank are averaging a 4.68 this patch, we should probably avoid playing them in most spots. So in conclusion, we want to only treat statistics as one variable in our overall decision-making process. But at the same time, we do need to recognize that statistics do exist for a reason, and try to avoid decisions that are not supported by the data, unless we have a very, very good reason for it. The fourth mistake that many people make when using TACTICS.TOOLS is misunderstanding and kind of misinterpreting what this delta value actually means. So again, delta refers to the difference in the average placement with and without a certain filter, with positive delta meaning worse than average, and negative delta meaning better than average. However, something confusing here is that having negative delta does not always mean that something is good. So for example, let's say we're playing Carthus, Akali, and Viego. If you wanted to see what the best Viego items are, we would find that almost every single item on Viego has a negative delta. However, this does not mean that all the items are actually good on Viego. Instead, all this means is that people who have items on Viego tend to do better than those without items on Viego. So what we need to do instead here is to look at the exact number. So even though items such as Titans and Red Buff have negative delta, if you have the choice, we would probably prefer to build other items with better stats, such as Bloodthirster, Hand of Justice, and Edge of Night. Another confusing thing here is you might ask, if you want the best items, why don't we just sort the items by delta? But if you do this, you'll see we get a bunch of items that don't make any sense on Viego, such as Redemption, Ionic Spark, Shiv, and Protector's Vow. And what this means is that these items are actually good on Viego, but these are items that are usually picked up very late into the game, such as from Carousels and Dragons. And people who made it to those stages in the game usually have a higher average placement. So we want to make sure that we only look at items that have a reasonable play rate, probably at least 1%, which is where we start seeing realistic items. And finally, the last thing I want to highlight here is the influence between the item's play rate and its delta. And this influence is that the higher the play rate of the item is, the less the delta can vary from the average. As you can imagine, for example, if an item had a 99% play rate, no matter how strong it actually was, it would be very, very close to an average delta, or a delta of 0.00, because it is simply built so frequently. And this is important because we need to take this into account when evaluating items. So for example, if you're looking at Carthus items, you might compare an item like Trojan, which is a delta of -0.06, to an item like Adaptive Helm, which is a delta of -0.16. And if you look at the numbers, we might think that Adaptive Helm is better than Carthus, is better on Carthus because the delta is better. But if you take into account the play rate and realize that Trojan has more than 6 times the play rate of Adaptive Helm, then we'll actually discover that the two options are much more comparable. So to summarize, negative delta does not always necessarily mean that something is good, and delta is heavily influenced by sample size, by making items with low sample size have extremely exaggerated statistics. And finally, as items increase in play rate, they have less overall potential to deviate from the average performance. The fifth and final mistake that I want to talk about today is a little bit different, and it's about overemphasizing this hexagon graphic right here that shows how well you perform in different areas of the game. Now don't get me wrong, I do really like this graphic. I think it's a really cool way to provide more specific insight into your gameplay, but as you can see, I think a lot of people kind of have the wrong idea about how relevant this data actually is to your gameplay. So as you can see, a frequent question that a lot of people ask is, how can I improve my execution score? Or how can I improve my flexibility score? And I think that's kind of the wrong way to look at this, right? The truth is that the goal shouldn't be to improve any of these scores. The goal should obviously be to win more and place higher in your games. And if you look at what these scores actually represent, right, you'll find that having a better score doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be performing better in your games. So for example, if you look at what the items grade is, it's based off how well your items fit your units in your comp, right? However, the truth is that having perfect items every game isn't actually a good thing necessarily. So for example, everybody knows that the best items on Ezreal, right, are Blue Buff, Red Buff, and Infinity Edge, right? But if we actually have those items on Ezreal every single game, we might have an S+ in items, but we will actually probably not be performing very well in the games, right? As it likely means we are greeting way too hard for the best possible items and being unwilling to stand worse items in certain spots, right? And another example of this is the flexibility score, right? Being more flexible and playing more comps and avoiding contesters doesn't necessarily mean you're actually going to be performing better in their games, right? For example, we've seen many instances of players climb to extremely high ranks, even to rank 1, with extremely inflexible playstyles. So yeah, once again, I think this is a really cool graphic, but I would definitely kind of avoid using it as a tool for directly improving my gameplay. Alright, that's all I have for you guys today. Thanks everyone for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope something was helpful. This is my first time making any sort of TFT content, so I would really appreciate any feedback or advice. Thanks again for watching, I really, really appreciate it. Bye bye.